They stepped onto the jet laughing, light, easy laughter that belonged to people who just promised forever. He brushed a stray curl from her face and she nudged his elbow, the kind of small, private jokes couples collect over time. Their boarding passes were pridefully crisp. The new wedding bands flashed under the cabin lights as if they were small suns. They'd paid for this flight like a gift to themselves. First-class seats on the way to Paris, an anniversary they'd been planning for months. Nothing about that morning felt urgent or heavy. It felt like permission to be selfish for once. He carried the carry-on, but she held the passport, fingers stroking the leather cover as if it were a talisman. On the jet bridge, they traded quick, happy sentences about dinner reservations and a hotel room with a balcony. Around them, people moved with the private, distracted attention of travelers. Emails to finish, maps to study, headphones to slide on. The couple smiled at a flight attendant and the attendant smiled back. It was a polite exchange, routine and brief. For a moment, it looked like every other flight. Then a look passed between two of the crew, barely more than the lift of an eyebrow. And the air shifted the way it does before a storm that never quite comes. The look was small, almost professional, a folded expression that dismissed or judged and moved on. The couple kept smiling, unaware. They eased into their seats, buckled, and leaned toward one another, the world reduced to the space of two hands and a shared joke. The plane smelled faintly of coffee and new upholstery. Overhead bins clicked shut. The captain's voice came on, crisp and courteous. Somewhere toward the front, a phone camera was already up and recording, someone practicing the tiny rituals of documenting travel. As the cabin filled, a younger, sharply dressed couple entered. They laughed loudly with the crew, their voice a practiced note that asked for attention. There was an exchange, two quick nods, a whisper at the front, a closed smile. And then, as if triggered by a private cue, one of the attendants walked straight toward the newlyweds. The words used were soft and corporate. There had been an adjustment. A seat needed to be freed. A passenger required accommodation. Everyone kept their tone casual. It was the kind of conversation that prefers efficiency to explanation. He looked up, polite confusion creasing his forehead. She toyed with the ring on her finger, puzzled. They had paid for these seats. No one had asked them to move when they booked. The attendant's explanation didn't land as an apology. It landed as an instruction. There was no warmth behind the smile now, only the mechanical certainty of someone who believes correction is owed and debate is unnecessary. They declined once, then again with calm. He said, "We paid for these seats." She added, quiet but firm, "We're not moving." Around them, murmurs started like soft static, voices that never fully coalesced into conversation but were big enough to be noticed. Phones lifted. A handful of heads turned. The same young couple looked on with a face that suggested surprise, then annoyance, then a satisfaction that had already decided the outcome. There was nothing violent in the way decisions were made that day. No shouted commands, no overt hostility. That was the dangerous part. Actions arrived wrapped in procedure, in the language of policy and safety. People like to think harm needs to shout. Sometimes it arrives politely, and that politeness is what allows it to be believed. They were asked again. The crew spoke into radios. The word non-compliant was used casually, as if naming a thing made its removal obvious. A uniformed presence appeared down the aisle, deliberate and steady. People reached for their phones, not to help, but to capture. 20 minutes after their laughter had glittered like a small private celebration, everything changed. But 20 minutes later, that joy turned into the kind of nightmare no one expects at 30,000 feet. If this grabbed you, hit subscribe now and drop your country in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. The rest of this story shows what one small refusal set into motion, and why a single phone call would end up toppling something much larger than a seat assignment. The boarding door closed with a soft thud, sealing the cabin in its world of murmurs, blinking lights, and overhead clicks. Andre leaned back against the wide seat, exhaling like he'd finally let go of months of overtime and endless planning. Lila adjusted the strap of her bag under the seat and grinned at him. Paris had felt like a dream. Until now, it was just postcards and magazines. This was real. Yet even in that glow, the unease started. Two attendants walked past the row, eyes flicking once, then again. One whispered into her colleague's ear, quick enough to seem nothing at all, but not so quick that Andre missed the glance that followed. It was that quiet assessment, the kind you feel more than you see. He reached for Lila's hand and squeezed. She didn't ask why. She'd lived enough to know. Minutes later, a couple appeared at the entrance. Younger, white, dressed for attention rather than comfort. The man laughed too loudly at his own joke, one arm slung casually around his partner's waist. She clutched a designer tote that practically shouted its price tag. They didn't shuffle down the aisle like everyone else. They paused, smiled at the lead attendant, and leaned in for a hushed exchange. The attendant's eyes darted toward Andre and Lila's row. The language came next, the kind that doesn't need to be explained if you've heard it before. Accommodations, adjustments, policy. Words meant to sound professional, but used like shields. They were phrases designed to close doors, not open dialogue. The lead attendant approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, ma'am, we'll need to ask you to switch seats. There's been an adjustment with our seating plan." Andre straightened slightly. "An adjustment?" "Yes. We need these seats for passengers who require specific accommodations." Her voice was even, practiced. Lila glanced around, noting the rows still empty in first class. "We paid for these seats?" she said softly, confusion knitting her brow. The attendant's smile tightened. "Of course, and we'll be happy to reseat you further back in the cabin." Andre's tone remained calm, steady from years of learning to keep his temper contained in situations exactly like this. "With respect, no. We booked these months ago. We're staying where we are." The attendant hesitated, that thin smile refusing to break. Behind her, the younger couple lingered, their expressions already annoyed, as though waiting for a table at a restaurant they believed they owned. One of them whispered, "This is ridiculous," loud enough for it to land. Lila's fingers dug lightly into Andre's palm. She whispered, "Just let's not." But the sentence trailed off. It wasn't a plea, just exhaustion. They'd lived through airports, restaurants, stores, the constant question of whether they belonged. This was supposed to be different. The attendant repeated herself, this time with less softness. "I'm afraid this isn't optional. We'll need you to move to row 9. You'll still be together, of course." Andre's voice was firmer now. "We're not moving. These are our seats." A silence stretched too long, passengers craning subtly to catch pieces of the exchange. The younger couple's smiles fell away, replaced with the impatience of people unused to being told no. The attendant's eyes flicked toward the front, where another crew member stood watching. Andre could hear the faint hiss of a radio clipped to her side. Her smile returned, but it was colder, thinner, like plastic stretched too tight. Lila shifted in her seat, back stiff, hand trembling slightly where it still held Andre's. The hum of the cabin seemed to dim, as though the air itself was waiting for the next word. Passengers glanced, then looked away, feigning distraction with their screens. Phones were already angled discreetly, recording. The attendant leaned in just a fraction, her voice still polite, but the veneer was gone. "Sir, ma'am, I'll ask you once more to relocate." And with that, the smile vanished completely. The smile was gone now, replaced by something sharper, less hidden. The attendant's voice cut through the low hum of boarding like a command. "Sir, ma'am, you are required to comply with crew instructions. If you continue to refuse, we'll have no choice but to escalate this matter." Andre tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but unwavering. "We paid for these seats. This is our right. We're not moving." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic, but it landed with the kind of finality that made the rows around them go still. Lila's fingers tightened on his sleeve. A wordless warning, her breath quickening. She'd been through enough moments like this to recognize how quickly policy could turn into something uglier. Another attendant arrived, this one holding a small black device clipped to her palm. She bent slightly, speaking low into it, but the words weren't low enough. Passengers nearby heard fragments. "Row 1, not cooperating, non-compliant." The phrase sliced through the air. Non-compliant. A label that could change everything. It wasn't just a word, it was an accusation. A justification waiting to be acted on. Andre closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. He had lived long enough to know how swiftly such labels could erase the truth of what actually happened. "We're asking politely," the attendant said again, though the politeness sounded brittle now, like glass ready to shatter. "But if you continue to resist, you'll leave us with no choice but to remove you." Andre spoke with deliberate control. "We are not resisting. We're sitting in the seats we paid for. There's nothing disruptive about that." Lila shifted uncomfortably, her hand brushing the edge of the seat back in front of her. The stares around them grew heavier, as if the couple were under a spotlight. Some passengers averted their eyes quickly, uncomfortable witnesses. Others leaned in closer, curiosity overtaking courtesy. A few held up their phones in plain sight, cameras blinking red. The younger white couple standing nearby exchanged amused glances, the woman whispering into her partner's ear. Their body language screamed entitlement, the kind that expected deference without question. Andre glanced at Lila. She looked small suddenly, her shoulders pressed inward, her eyes darting between him and the attendants. Her voice was soft, edged with tremor. "Please, just don't let it get worse." But worse was already on its way. The lead attendant stepped back slightly, raising her chin as though reaching for authority she hadn't yet displayed. Her voice was louder this time, designed for the cabin to hear. "These passengers are refusing to comply with crew instructions. We'll need airport security to assist." The words hit like a gavel, delivered not as a request, but as a judgment. It was the kind of announcement that carried weight, the kind that reframed perception in an instant. Andre and Lila weren't a couple on their way to celebrate. They were suddenly framed as a problem. Murmurs rippled through the rows. A man muttered, "What did they do?" A woman shook her head, whispering, "Just let them sit." But the label had already been spoken, and it echoed louder than their defense. Andre sat straighter, his jaw tight, but his voice even. "We are not disruptive. We are not refusing. We are sitting in the seats we purchased. That is all." Lila reached for his hand again, her grip almost desperate now. She could feel it, the shift from an inconvenience to a confrontation. She whispered, "They're making an example of us." The attendant pressed her radio once more. "Copy, ready for removal." And in that instant the cabin transformed. Bones lifted higher. Screens glowed in the dim cabin light. Some passengers leaned over aisles for a better view. Others turned away, ashamed to witness but unwilling to intervene. The murmurs grew louder, mixing disbelief with curiosity until they became a single, restless hum. Every camera pointed forward now, waiting, recording, capturing. And then the word repeated, louder, heavier, carried through the cabin like an indictment. Non-compliant. The label stuck, and the phones kept rolling. The aisle cleared in a ripple of shifting knees and folded trays. A pair of uniformed security officers stepped onto the plane, their presence like a verdict already passed. One of the attendants gestured toward Andre and Lila's row, her voice firm and rehearsed. Row 1. Non-compliant passengers. The phrase rang out like a headline, written before the story had even been told. Non-compliant. It was a label that carried weight, one that excused whatever came next. Andre straightened in his seat. He had been through moments like this before. Meetings where his voice was ignored, restaurants where the service slowed the second he walked in, sidewalks where strangers crossed the street at his approach. But this was different. This was his wife's anniversary trip. These were their paid-for seats. This was their dignity on display before dozens of watching strangers. One officer leaned down. "Sir, you've been asked multiple times. It's time to leave the aircraft." Andre kept his voice calm, his tone deliberate, each word chosen to leave no room for accusation. "Officer, we are seated in the tickets we purchased. We have not disrupted this flight. We have not raised our voices. We have not refused lawful instructions. We are simply sitting where we belong." The officer's jaw flexed, but his hand still reached toward Andre's shoulder. "You need to come with us. Now." Lila's voice cracked, rising with fear. "He hasn't done anything. He's not a threat. Why are you treating him like this?" Around them, passengers stirred, the quiet shuffling of bodies betraying discomfort. A woman across the aisle whispered, "This doesn't look right." Another muttered, "Leave them alone." Phones angled higher, lenses gleaming. Every movement was captured, every word immortalized. The attendant's expression hardened. "Ma'am, please sit back. We'll resolve this quickly." But nothing about it was quick. Nothing about it was clean. The second officer grasped Andre's arm. He rose to his feet under their pressure, jacket slipping from his lap, his passport tumbling against the seat. He didn't fight. He didn't resist. He let his body stand with a dignity that refused to be erased. "I can walk," he said evenly, holding his hand slightly away from his body so the cameras would see. "There's no need to touch me. I am not resisting." Yet still, the grip tightened, steering him toward the aisle. Lila clutched at his other arm, her fingers trembling. "Don't take him, please. This is our anniversary." Her voice broke, too raw to be ignored. It cracked through the cabin, turning murmurs into open protest. A passenger shouted, "This is wrong." Another added, "He hasn't done anything." The hum of outrage grew, louder than the captain's announcements, louder than the engines idling outside the cabin. But the crew stood silent. Their authority clung to like armor. The white couple whose arrival had sparked this confrontation shifted uneasily but said nothing, their entitlement folding now into cowardice. Andre looked back at Lila, their eyes locking. He forced a steady smile. "It's all right, I'll be right behind you." But it wasn't all right, because in the next second, as her hand slid from his sleeve, her face drained of color. Her breath caught sharply, like air trapped behind a wall. Her body stiffened, then folded against the seat. A ragged gasp tore from her throat. Lila's hands flew to her chest. Her eyes widened in terror. Her mouth opened, but no words came, only the sound of breath clawing for escape. Passengers screamed. A man leapt from his seat shouting, "She's going down!" A phone clattered to the floor as someone rushed forward. Andre spun back, breaking free of the officer's grip. "Lila!" he cried. And there she was, slumped against the window, gasping for air, her body trembling as if every breath might be her last. The cabin, once filled with routine chatter and the rustle of boarding, fractured into chaos. Lila's gasps echoed through the aisle, each one sharper than the last. Passengers shouted for help, their voices colliding into a storm of panic. "Get a doctor! Somebody get a doctor!" a woman yelled, standing halfway out of her seat. Andre tore free from the officer's grip, dropping to his knees beside his wife. He cradled her head against his chest, his voice breaking. "Breathe, baby. Stay with me, please." His hands trembled as he brushed the hair from her face, searching for any sign of relief. Phones were raised in every direction now, cameras recording not just an argument but a medical emergency. Some passengers wept. Others shouted at the crew. Yet the flight attendants, the very people sworn maintain safety, stood rooted in place, radios pressed to their mouths. Their words were clinical, hollow. "Medical emergency. Request paramedics at gate." The younger white couple, those who had whispered with the crew, stared wide-eyed at the scene. Their arrogance had drained into guilt. The woman clutched her tote bag like a shield, whispering frantically to her partner. The man avoided Andre's eyes, staring instead at the carpet, as if pretending not to exist could erase the role they had played. Andre pressed his forehead against Lila's, whispering prayers. "Stay with me, love. Just hold on. You're stronger than this." He remembered their first date, her laughter over shared coffee, her promise at the altar to always walk with him. He held on to those images now, as if memory alone could keep her heart beating. A passenger in row 2 pushed through, identifying himself as a nurse. He dropped to the floor, ripping open the emergency kit. "She's tachycardic. Get me oxygen now." His hands moved swiftly, attaching pads, lifting Lila's chin, checking for a pulse. But when he looked up at the crew, the attendants froze. One stammered, "We're checking for authorization." "Authorization?" the nurse barked. "She's dying in front of you." The attendants didn't move. Their eyes shifted toward the cockpit, waiting for instructions, hiding behind words like protocol and procedure. The passengers erupted in fury. "Do something," one shouted. Another raised her phone higher, recording every second. Someone yelled, "This airline's gonna pay for this." Finally, another crew member shoved the oxygen mask forward. The nurse clamped it over Lila's face, her chest jerking as air flooded her lungs. Andre's tears streaked down his cheeks, his hand never leaving hers. "You're okay, baby. You're okay." But even as he said it, her breaths came shallow, uneven. The captain's voice broke through the overhead speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, this flight is grounded. Please remain seated as we return to the gate for medical assistance." His tone was flat, mechanical, but passengers cheered in relief. They knew every second mattered. The uniformed officers who had tried to remove Andre stood awkwardly near the aisle, their authority crumbling in real time. One shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Andre's gaze. They had come for a removal. Now they stood accused by silence, complicit in what had unfolded. Minutes dragged like hours until paramedics stormed the cabin, pushing a stretcher down the narrow aisle. Their presence was electric, focused, efficient, unburdened by politics or protocol. They worked quickly, cutting away fabric, attaching monitors, preparing to lift her. Andre rose only to follow, his hand locked around Lila's fingers. Passengers leaned back, pressing against armrests to give space. Some whispered prayers. Others cursed under their breath. One man shouted, "She didn't have to collapse for you to see this was wrong." Still, the airline staff kept their eyes lowered, glued to their radios, refusing to meet Andre's gaze. They hid in the comfort of policy, but their silence screamed louder than any defense they could give. As Lila was carried off, Andre walked beside the stretcher, his face drawn but defiant. Cameras flashed from every angle, capturing not just a woman fighting for her life, but a husband refusing to let her be forgotten. The couple that had been meant to replace them sat frozen, shame washing over their smug expressions. They had no laughter now, no whispered jokes, only silence. Andre stepped off the plane, following the stretcher toward the waiting ambulance. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew what the cameras had already captured. And that night, as Lila lay in a hospital bed surrounded by wires and machines, Andre made one call, just one. And the ripple hit harder than anyone could imagine. The hospital waiting room was cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Andre sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight as if pressing them together could hold his world in place. Beyond the swinging double doors, machines beeped steadily, a rhythm both comforting and terrifying. Every time they beeped, he knew Lila was still fighting. Every pause made his chest tighten. His suit was wrinkled from the scuffle, his tie loosened and crooked, his shoes scuffed from kneeling on the cabin floor. None of it mattered. What mattered was the woman behind those doors, the woman who had laughed with him just hours earlier as they checked their bags, talking about croissants and Eiffel Tower selfies. Now she lay tethered to monitors because of humiliation disguised as protocol. Andre pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands shook as he scrolled. He stopped on a name he hadn't called in years. Marcus Bennett, his cousin. The one who had left Mississippi with nothing but a scholarship and sheer determination, and returned decades later as one of the country's most recognizable civil rights attorneys. No, not just in courtrooms, but on news panels, in op-eds, and in the streets where his voice carried through megaphones. Andre stared at the name for a long moment. Then, with a breath that trembled, he pressed call. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Dre? It's been a long time." Andre's throat tightened. "Marcus, it happened. It finally happened." A pause. "Where are you?" "St. Mary's, Chicago. They dragged me off the plane." "Lila," his voice cracked. He couldn't finish. "Is she alive?" "She's alive, but barely. They called her collapse a medical event." Andre's tone was bitter, like the words themselves tasted rotten. Marcus was silent for a beat, then, "Was anyone recording?" Andre gave a hollow laugh. "Everyone was. It's already online." He glanced at the screen of his phone. Notifications were pouring in. Messages from strangers, clips forwarded, hashtags exploding. Justice for Lila was climbing fast. Videos of the incident had racked up millions of views in mere hours. People weren't just watching, they were outraged. Airport terminals were already swelling with protesters. Signs painted hastily on cardboard read, "Dignity has no seat assignment," and "Accountability at 30,000 feet." Crowds chanted outside terminals in Chicago, Atlanta, New York. They weren't just angry about Andre and Lila. They were angry about the pattern. The quiet, constant pattern of who gets questioned, who gets moved, who gets labeled non-compliant. Andre scrolled again, jaw tightening. News outlets were running the footage under bold banners. First-class couple removed, wife collapses. Comment sections flooded with disbelief. One woman wrote, "I fly first class all the time. No one's ever asked me to move. Why them?" Another said, "This is racial profiling, period. I've seen it happen too many times." The airline, scrambling to contain the fire, released a statement by noon. "We regret the unfortunate medical event that occurred on Flight 244. Our thoughts are with the affected passengers. We are conducting an internal review." Andre read it on his phone, jaw clenched. Medical event. As though Lila had simply fainted, as though their actions hadn't provoked a chain reaction that ended with her strapped to machines. No mention of his name. No acknowledgement of the humiliation. Just sterilized words designed to shield stock prices. Marcus's voice cut through his spiral. "Dre, listen to me. They didn't just disrespect you. They endangered her life. And they did it because they thought you wouldn't fight back. But they picked the wrong man and the wrong family." Andre closed his eyes. "I don't want their money." "Good," Marcus said sharply. "Because this isn't about a payout. It's about exposure. This airline doesn't realize who they just pushed too far. They've made this personal. I'll be there by morning. And when I arrive, We won't be asking for apologies. We'll be demanding accountability." Andre gripped the phone tighter, his throat burning, his chest tight with a mix of fear and resolve. He turned his gaze back to the double doors where Lila fought for her life. And in that waiting room, under harsh fluorescent lights, the fight shifted. It was no longer just about 2 seats on a plane. It was about every passenger who had ever been told they didn't belong. It was about to become a reckoning. Marcus's voice was calm but unyielding. This airline doesn't realize who they just pushed too far. By sunrise, the internet had already done what corporations fear most. It turned a moment into a movement. Clips from inside the cabin, shaky but powerful, flooded timelines. One video captured the exact moment the attendant used the phrase, non-compliant. Another caught Lila clutching her chest as Andre shouted for help. In each angle, what struck viewers wasn't chaos, but calm. Andre never raised his voice, never fought back. He simply refused to surrender seats he had purchased. Witnesses began stepping forward. A teacher from Ohio, seated 3 rows back, spoke to reporters. "I heard one of the attendants whisper, 'They don't look like they belong here.' That stuck with me. It wasn't about policy, it was about appearance." Another passenger, a nurse, posted a lengthy thread. "I was there. The walkers were polite, quiet. The crew singled them out. I know what I heard, and it wasn't about safety. It was about who was allowed to sit in first class." Those accounts lit a fire under the story. By mid-morning, national headlines carried variations of the same line: young black couple targeted on flight. Anchors spoke with grave faces, the footage playing on loops behind them. Panelists dissected the meaning of non-compliant, asking why that label always seemed to fall hardest on black and brown passengers. Stock markets noticed too. The airline's shares dipped steadily through the day as hashtags surged. #Justice for Lila, seats not skin, accountability at 30K. Travelers began canceling flights in solidarity, posting screenshots of their refunded tickets, alongside captions like, "I won't fund discrimination." At airports across the country, protests broke out almost overnight. Crowds gathered at check-in counters, holding signs scrawled with urgency. "We paid too. Not your image problem. Respect every passenger." In New York, a crowd chanted Andre's words. "We paid for these seats. This is our right." Andre, meanwhile, remained in the hospital beside Lila, her hand dwarfed in his. Machines beeped steadily, her face pale but fighting. He didn't watch the news. He didn't need to. The storm outside was already louder than anything he could say. Marcus handled the media, issuing sharp statements that cut straight through corporate spin. This was not a medical event. This was a preventable crisis caused by racial bias dressed up as procedure. The airline tried to respond, but every word rang hollow. Their second statement mentioned safety protocols and crew discretion, but social media tore it apart within minutes. One viral reply read, "Safety isn't asking 2 newlyweds to give up their seats for a younger white couple." That's not safety. That's racism. Every hour brought new testimony. Former passengers shared eerily similar stories, being asked to move, being questioned, being treated as out of place in cabins they had every right to occupy. One man recalled being told his upgrade was under review, even as white passengers with later bookings walked past him to first class. The pattern was undeniable. The Walker's case wasn't isolated, it was systemic. Then came the moment that shifted the ground entirely. Late in the evening, a journalist at a major outlet tweeted, "We've obtained internal training documents from inside the airline. Developing story." The documents were explosive. They outlined vague image management guidelines, suggesting that attendants maintain cabin consistency and ensure customer comfort expectations. On the surface, it sounded like corporate jargon, but in practice, as whistleblowers later explained, it meant pushing aside passengers who didn't fit the unspoken look of first class. One line in particular caught the world's attention. In sensitive seating scenarios, prioritize discretion and optics to maintain premium experience. The leak confirmed what Andre and Lila had felt in their bones, that they weren't removed because of safety or necessity or policy. They were removed because they didn't look like the airline's idea of first class. Screenshots of the documents spread faster than the airline could react. Commentators called it the smoking gun. Stock prices tumbled further. Civil rights organizations issued statements demanding federal investigation. And in the hospital, Andre looked at Marcus with tired but resolute eyes. He didn't need to say it aloud. Marcus already knew. The fight had moved beyond one couple. It had become a mirror held up to the entire industry. That night, the journalist revealed the source of the leak, an anonymous employee inside the airline, ready to testify. The documents hit the news cycle like a hammer. Screenshots spread across feeds, reposted, dissected, analyzed line by line. At first glance, they looked like any other corporate manual, sterile language about brand image, premium expectations, and customer comfort. But the whistleblower's testimony explained what those phrases really meant. Image management, the files read, was not about tidy uniforms or clean trays. It was about who was allowed to represent the airline's idea of luxury. The leaked notes instructed flight attendants to ensure cabin consistency and maintain expectations of premium clientele. And when pressed in interviews, the whistleblower said plainly, passengers of color were flagged as out of place in first class. We were told to find reasons to move them, quietly, without confrontation, but firmly. It happened more often than anyone wants to admit. The country recoiled. Overnight, the story shifted from a tragic incident to a systemic indictment. Andre and Lila were not exceptions. They were proof of a pattern long whispered about, but rarely documented. The words in those documents confirmed what so many had felt in their bones. Access to dignity in the air wasn't guaranteed. It was filtered through bias wrapped in procedure. Civil rights organizations responded instantly. The NAACP released a statement calling the documents a window into institutional discrimination. A coalition of black physicians groups publicly aligned with Andre, highlighting how many of their members had reported similar treatment. Grassroots activists organized boycotts, urging travelers to avoid the airline until accountability was more than a press release. In Chicago, protesters filled the street outside the airline's regional office. Their chants rose like thunder. Seats not skin, seats not skin. Handmade signs carried Lila's face, her wedding photo beside the words, "She belongs." News anchors replayed the footage of Andre refusing to move, overlaying it with the damning lines from the manual. Commentators didn't need to editorialize. The documents spoke for themselves. One anchor read them aloud, then paused, visibly shaken. Ensure cabin consistency, maintain premium optics. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not service. That's segregation. Andre stayed at the hospital, his world narrowed to the steady beep of Lila's monitors. But Marcus knew how to move in storms like this. He spent hours with reporters, highlighting how policies dressed up in corporate language had real, human consequences. When you reduce dignity to optics, you strip people of their humanity, Marcus said at a press conference. Andre and Lila didn't just face humiliation, they nearly lost everything, because this airline decided they didn't look like first class. The backlash was immediate and costly. Within days, the airline's stock value plunged further. Analysts speculated on billions in potential losses if boycotts continued. Other carriers scrambled to distance themselves, issuing statements about their own inclusive practices, though many passengers rolled their eyes at the sudden timing. Inside corporate headquarters, the panic was palpable. Executives called emergency board meetings, their polished confidence slipping as headlines grew harsher by the hour. They debated strategy, offer a settlement, fire a few mid-level managers, roll out sensitivity training as a shield, but every option seemed flimsy against the tidal wave of outrage. In one leaked email, a VP warned, "This is escalating beyond brand recovery. We may be facing regulatory intervention if we can't contain it." The irony was cruel. For years, the airline had obsessed over containment, containing optics, containing passengers who didn't match their image of wealth. Now the containment was out of their hands. The narrative had shifted, and the country wasn't letting go. But while executives wrung their hands behind closed doors, Marcus was already plotting in the open. He had assembled a coalition of civil rights lawyers, aviation experts, and former airline employees willing to testify. The lawsuit was no longer just about damages, it was about exposure. Andre, exhausted but resolute, gave his cousin one instruction: no settlement, not for any amount. They need to face this in daylight. And daylight was coming fast. That same evening, as executives huddled in an emergency board meeting, drafting their damage control strategy, they didn't know Marcus Bennett was already 2 steps ahead, preparing to unveil evidence that would make recovery impossible. The courthouse steps looked less like an entrance to justice and more like a rallying ground. By dawn, journalists jostled for angles, cameras clicked in rapid bursts, and activists filled the sidewalks with signs raised high. Seats not skin, dignity can't be downgraded, justice for Lila. Inside, every bench was packed. Civil rights leaders, former airline staff willing to testify, and everyday travelers who had flown enough to know this case wasn't about a single couple. It was about a system. When Andre entered the courtroom, he didn't stride in with bravado. He walked with quiet steadiness, his suit pressed but modest, his gaze forward. Lila was not beside him, still in recovery, but her presence was etched in every step he took. The sight of him drew murmurs through the crowd, not of gossip but of respect. The airline's attorneys sat stiffly at their table, armed with binders, tablets, and carefully rehearsed arguments. Their lead counsel, a man with slicked-back hair and a voice trained to command juries, wasted no time. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and declared, "This case is not about race. It is about safety. Our crew acted within established protocols to ensure a secure flight environment. Their discretion, while perhaps misunderstood, was lawful and necessary." Safety, that word hung in the air like a shield. It was the card airlines had always played, the unchallengeable defense. Who would dare argue against safety? But Marcus Bennett rose slowly, his presence filling the room without theatrics. He didn't match fire with fire. Instead, he opened a folder and projected still frames from passenger recordings onto the courtroom screen. The image was damning. Andre seated calmly, hands folded, speaking evenly as attendants labeled him non-compliant. Another video rolled, showing Lila clutching her chest as security dragged Andre toward the aisle. Marcus's voice was deliberate, measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, you just saw it with your own eyes. This wasn't safety. This was humiliation masquerading as policy." The defense objected, but the judge waved it aside. One by one, witnesses were called. A nurse described the panic as Lila collapsed. A teacher recounted hearing the words, "They don't look like they belong here." A passenger admitted he had hesitated to intervene but felt haunted ever since. Each testimony layered over the last, painting a picture too consistent to dismiss. When Andre was called, the courtroom held its breath. He took the stand, shoulders squared, voice steady. "We just wanted to celebrate love," he said. "That's all. A simple anniversary trip. Instead, we were treated like criminals. My wife collapsed because of the stress, because of the way we were singled out, not for what we did, but for who we are." His words weren't dramatic, but they carried the weight of lived truth. Some jurors leaned forward. Others blinked back tears. The silence afterward was heavier than any gavel. The airline's lawyers scrambled to recover. They circled back to their mantra of safety. "Crew discretion is critical," the lead counsel insisted. "When passengers refuse instructions, it creates potential risk. Our clients were following training, not targeting anyone." Marcus stepped forward, clicking to the next exhibit. On the screen appeared an excerpt from the leaked training manual. "Maintain cabin consistency, ensure premium optics." He let the words linger before turning to the jury. "Tell me, where in those lines do you see safety? Do you see oxygen masks, evacuation drills, engine procedures? Or do you see something else? An obsession with appearance, with image, with who belongs and who does not?" The room stirred. The defense objected again, overruled. But Marcus wasn't finished. He pulled a final piece of evidence from his briefcase, a USB drive. He handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. With a nod, the judge allowed the video to play. The grainy footage filled the screen. It showed two flight attendants in a jet bridge before boarding. One leaned toward the other and whispered, "First class will look off today. That couple, they don't look like they belong up there." The words landed like a bomb. The courtroom gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously. A juror's hand flew to her mouth. Andre lowered his head, not in defeat, but in quiet vindication. Everything they had endured was captured in those 6 words. The jury sat frozen, eyes wide, as the damning video played to its end, proof not of safety protocols, but of bias spoken aloud. The courtroom buzzed with attention so thick it felt alive. Every journalist had their pen hovering, every activist leaned forward, every camera light burned hot. The judge's gavel struck once, and silence fell. The verdict was read slowly, each word landing like a stone against glass. "We, the jury, find the defendant Airline guilty of racial discrimination, emotional distress, and reckless endangerment." Andre closed his eyes. He didn't pump his fist or shout. He simply lowered his head, a single tear sliding down his cheek. This wasn't triumph. It was vindication. The courtroom erupted, supporters clapping, reporters rushing for sound bites, civil rights leaders hugging one another in relief. The defense table sat frozen, their strategy crumbling into dust. For the first time, the airline's counsel looked small, dwarfed by the weight of what had just been declared. The judge continued. The airline was ordered to compensate Andre and Layla not just for medical costs and damages, but with a settlement figure so staggering it sent shockwaves through the industry. More importantly, the verdict mandated sweeping reforms: independent oversight of crew training, mandatory anti-discrimination protocols, and quarterly reporting to federal regulators. The words court-supervised reform hit the executives hardest. They couldn't hide behind closed doors anymore. Within hours, the fallout began. 3 top executives, including the CEO, announced their resignations under personal reasons. Shareholders demanded answers, furious at how arrogance and prejudice had gutted their investments. The airline's stock plunged to its lowest point in a decade, wiping billions from its market value. Analysts spoke bluntly. This isn't just about money. This is about trust. And trust once lost doesn't rebound overnight. Government officials seized the moment. A Senate committee announced hearings into discriminatory practices in aviation. Lawmakers lined up in front of microphones, pledging to ensure equal skies for all. The case had become more than one lawsuit. It was now a catalyst for systemic change. Outside, crowds cheered when the verdict was announced, their chants echoing through the streets. Seats not skin, seats not skin. Strangers hugged. Protesters wept openly. For once, the phrase "justice served" didn't feel hollow. Inside the hospital, Lila watched the coverage on a muted television. Tubes still lined her arms, monitors still traced her heartbeat, but her smile returned as she saw her husband standing tall, reporters surrounding him. Her voice was weak but steady. "You did it, Dre. You kept your promise." Andre kissed her hand. "No," he whispered. "We did it. They tried to take our seats. Instead, we took their shield away." News cycles replayed his testimony on loop. Civil rights groups hailed him as a symbol of quiet resistance. Editorials flooded newspapers, demanding airlines across the nation review their practices. Even international outlets carried the story, framing it as proof of how systemic racism travels with a passport of its own. Meanwhile, in boardrooms across the country, executives panicked. If this could happen to one airline, it could happen to them. Compliance officers scrambled to scrub policies, PR teams rushed to issue statements of inclusivity, but the public wasn't buying it. Too many passengers had their own stories of humiliation and dismissal. Andre and Lila's ordeal had simply forced the nation to listen. Marcus stepped before cameras once more, his voice calm but resolute. This wasn't about a payout. This wasn't about headlines. This was about human dignity. Today, a jury said loud and clear, dignity is not negotiable, and no corporation is too big to be held accountable. As applause filled the press room, Andre stood beside him, quiet as ever, his eyes fixed not on the flashing lights, but on the thought of Lila resting safely back at the hospital. The airline tried one final press release, an apology to those who felt impacted. The wording was vague, evasive, and tone-deaf. It only fueled more outrage. Commentators mocked it live on air. Felt impacted? She collapsed in her seat. He was dragged off in front of cameras. This wasn't feelings, it was fact. The truth was undeniable. The verdict wasn't just a legal blow, it was a cultural turning point. And as the noise settled that night, the headlines blared numbers and resignations, but Andre's reflection cut deeper than any financial fallout. This was never about money, it was about dignity. And dignity, once defended, can never be taken back. Not by policy, not by procedure, not by... Andre and Lila weren't celebrities. They didn't walk onto that plane with cameras following them or entourages clearing a path. They weren't wealthy heirs or household names. They were everyday people, a husband and wife who had worked hard, loved deeply, and saved carefully for the kind of trip that marked a milestone. Their only request that day was to be treated as passengers with the same rights as anyone else on board. And yet, because of who they were and what they looked like, their dignity was questioned. Their presence was treated as an inconvenience to be corrected. The seats they paid for were reduced to privileges that could be stripped away on a whim. That kind of injustice doesn't announce itself with loud declarations. It comes quietly, disguised in uniforms, couched in words like policy and procedure. It hides behind smiles that stiffen the moment resistance is offered. What made this moment different was not that it happened, it was that Andre refused to accept it in silence. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't lash out, he stood firm in his calm insistence. We paid for these seats, this is our right. And in doing so, he exposed something bigger than himself. He revealed the rot that grows when institutions normalize bias and call it safety. When humiliation is dressed up as discretion, when injustice is carried out with a polite smile. That refusal, paired with the tragedy of Lila's collapse, forced the world to pay attention. Passengers with phones captured what could not be denied. Strangers lifted their voices. And when Andre made that one call, the ripple didn't stop at the hospital doors. It spread through courtrooms, newsrooms, boardrooms, and eventually into the highest offices of government. The verdict proved that dignity isn't negotiable. The protests showed that silence no longer protects corporations from scrutiny. And the resignations of executives reminded every company that no amount of wealth or branding can insulate them from the truth once it comes to light. But perhaps the most powerful echo of all is what this means for those who come after. Couples who book a seat in first class should never have to wonder if their faces will be judged before their boarding passes are scanned. Families should never brace themselves for whispers of non-compliant, simply because they exist in spaces some believe they don't belong. Students, workers, retirees, anyone who steps onto a plane should know their humanity will not be questioned at 30,000 feet. Andre and Lila's story isn't just about injustice. It's about resilience. It's about the quiet strength of a man kneeling by his wife while the world filmed, refusing to let her collapse be dismissed as a medical event. It's about a family that turned humiliation into history, making sure others would not have to endure the same. One call, that's all it took. To prove that dignity, once defended, can shut down even the largest machine. And now, it's your turn. What would you have done in Andre and Lila's situation? Would you have stayed seated, calm but unmovable? Would you have raised your voice when the label non-compliant was thrown around so casually? Tell us in the comments, share your thoughts, drop your country flag, and let us know where you're watching from. And if this story struck a chord with you, subscribe for more true human stories that shine a light on the realities so often ignored. Because stories like this remind us, dignity is priceless.